A man's entire world is the faint, rhythmic pulse of a machine he cannot see, a sound he has been trained to trust. It is November 14th, 1971, and 180 nautical miles off the coast of Cape Cod. The Cold War is a long, patient game of listening. But the sound that is now emerging from the static is not the sound of a ship passing in the night. It is the sound of a secret being carefully, deliberately buried in the cold, silent dark. The wind over the North Atlantic on this day sounds like iron being scraped across canvas. The sea is a chaos of white caps that fracture into a foam that sparkles like salt glass in the slicing cold sun. It is a world of immense, impersonal power. But deep inside the gray hull of the destroyer escort USS Voge, another world exists, one of low, humming lights and the pale green glow of cathode ray instruments. This is the Combat Information Center, the ship's electronic heart and mind. Smoke from a dozen cigarettes hangs in a slow, oily halo in the recycled air. A ring of men and women are bent over their displays and charts, their movements economical and precise. Here, the language of the outside world is translated into data, and no one speaks that language more fluently than Petty Officer David Hernandez. At 21 years old, his brown hands already look like worn maps, creased with the lines of intense focus. His headphones are snug against his ears, and his eyes, narrowed in concentration, are fixed on the circular screen of his sonar console. For Hernandez, this console is like a second skin. He has spent thousands of hours listening, learning to read the cadence of the ocean. He knows the Atlantic's many voices, the distant cry of gulls, the laboring groan of a freighter's engines, the deep, whale-based thrum of thermoclines where layers of cold water meet. He is an artist of patterns. Sonar, he knows, is a language. A surface ship is a steady, predictable conversation of propeller beats and engine noise. A whale is a living thing, stumbling through the water with a song of strange vowels and organic rhythms. But a man-made heartbeat, a submarine, has a sound all its own. It never quite matches the ocean's natural meter. On his screen, a passive bearing trace marks the movement of a contact he has been tracking for hours. It is a simple blip labeled Sierra 12. For the first part of his watch, it behaved as expected. A Soviet submarine on a routine patrol, its course steady, its presence a normal part of this underwater chessboard. But something has changed. Hernandez removes his headphones for a moment, the sudden silence of the CIC feeling loud in his ears. He rubs his eyes and checks the hard copy logs, the tip of his pencil worn down to a nub. For the last 3 hours, this contact has behaved oddly. It has slowed, changed course slightly, and now, something else. He closes his free hand on the cool, vibrating edge of the console, as if he can steady the world through his fingertips. "Sir," he says, his voice soft but clear, cutting through the low hum of the room. "Bearing drifts stopped. Contact holding position." Across the room, Lieutenant Commander James McKittridge, a man in his mid-40s whose natural naval poise has been softened by years at sea, pushes his cigarette into a crowded ashtray. He walks over to Hernandez's station and reads the trace on the screen. He then glances at a classified chart overlay. On it, a small red rectangle marks a set of coordinates that do not exist on any public map. Alpha 7, McKittridge says. The name lands in the room like a mortar round. Heads snap up from their consoles. A junior officer quickly checks a piece of paperwork, his jaw tightening. Alpha 7 is not just a location, it is a critical nerve junction, a point on the ocean floor where vital undersea communication cables intersect. The crew of the CIC works with the minimal, efficient motion of a surgical team. Orders are not shouted over loudspeakers. They travel in quiet commands, in glances, and subtle hand gestures. McKittridge gives the order, close the distance, maintain the baffles, the blind spot directly behind the ship, and create minimal wake. The USS Voge slips through the heavy Atlantic swell like a shadow, its own presence masked, becoming a silent observer in a developing underwater drama. As the Voge closes in, Hernandez watches the data from Sierra 12 grow clearer and more confusing. The Soviet submarine's movements are not random. The trace shows it moving inbound at 8 knots, then slowing to 4, then to 0. It is now station-keeping, holding its position with incredible precision at a depth of 400 feet. It is holding steady enough, as the old sonarman saying goes, to balance a bell on a string. "It's not drift, sir," Hernandez reports, his voice tight with a new understanding. "It's deliberate station keeping. That's not a patrol. That's work." McKittrick's face is a map of its own, showing worry, recognition, and the distant recall of highly classified briefings. He knows what lies on the seabed at Alpha 7. "They're right over the junction coordinates," he says, more to himself than to anyone else. "Hold our position. Observe. No active pings." Hernandez nods, his fingers gently adjusting a knob, fine-tuning the gain, listening with an intensity that borders on prayer. The entire room seems to be breathing shallow, waiting. Then a new sound emerges from the deep. It is a faint, high-pitched mechanical whining. It is not a distant sound. It is sharp, close, like a wet fingernail being dragged slowly across a wineglass. Hernandez freezes, his hand hovering in mid-turn. "Winch," he says, his voice a whisper. Something's being lowered from the sub. The sound signature is unmistakable. It is the sound of a heavy winch operating under load. It lasts for 17 minutes. Then, silence. A few moments later, the sound returns, this time in reverse, the whine of a winch hauling something back up. Shortly after, the contact Sierra 12 comes back to life. It begins to move, accelerating to 12 knots and heading east, out to the open sea. It has finished its work. McKittrick is already on the encrypted radio. Flash to Atlantic Fleet Headquarters. Soviet submarine observed at Junction Alpha 7, deploying or recovering equipment. Request guidance and salvage assets. We are maintaining position, keeping all surface traffic clear. The message goes out, a single spark of electricity traveling thousands of miles, carrying with it a question that will soon reach the highest levels of the United States government. What exactly did the Soviets just leave behind in the dark? The message from the USS Voge, encoded and urgent, travels not like a piece of routine communication, but like a hot coal being passed from hand to hand up the chain of command. In the cold, sterile world of naval communications, messages are assigned a priority level. This one, bearing the flash designator, bypasses the normal queues. It is the highest priority, reserved for initial enemy contact or situations of extreme and immediate importance. Within minutes, it arrives at the Atlantic Fleet's main operations room in Norfolk, Virginia. This is a vast, brass-lit cavern of bureaucracy and power, a place where the strategic chessboard of the entire Atlantic Ocean is monitored around the clock. Men in crisp naval uniforms and civilian analysts in suits crowd under a massive wall-sized map of the world, where the movements of ships and submarines are tracked with a quiet, relentless intensity. The arrival of the flash message from the Voge has an immediate and galvanizing effect. A duty officer reads the decoded text and understands its implications instantly. A Soviet nuclear submarine is not just transiting near a critical undersea cable. It has stopped, hovered, and conducted a physical operation directly over a top-secret junction point. This is not a random act. It is a deliberate and potentially devastating intelligence operation. A phone is lifted, connecting the operations room to a secure line at the Pentagon. The information flows upward from the Fleet Command to the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt. From there, it makes its way to the highest echelon secrecy of the nation's intelligence community. To Admiral Noel Gaylor, the director of the National Security Agency, the NSA, and to Richard Helms, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The message is brief, but every word is heavy with meaning. Soviet sub at junction. Alpha 7 deploying equipment. Request guidance. For the men who are now reading these words, men who understand the secret cartography of the Cold War, this is not just a report. It is an alarm. The undersea cables that crisscross the Atlantic are the central nervous system of the Western Alliance. They carry the most sensitive information imaginable: diplomatic communications, financial data, and most importantly, the encrypted traffic from the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS. SOSUS is America's secret weapon in the underwater war. It is a vast, clandestine network of hydrophones, underwater microphones, laid out on the seabed at strategic choke points. It is designed to listen for the unique acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines, allowing the U.S. Navy to track their movements across the entire ocean basin. Junction Alpha 7 is a critical hub in this network. a place where multiple SOSUS cables converge. If the Soviets have found a way to tap into that cable, they have not just cut a wire, they have placed a listening device directly inside the ear of the U.S. Navy. In Washington, a decision is made with a speed that is almost unheard of in the peacetime bureaucracy. A new message, authenticated with the highest level codes, is drafted and sent back down the chain of command, destined for the bridge of the USS Voge. Back in the CIC of the destroyer escort, less than 40 minutes after sending his initial report, Lieutenant Commander McKittrick receives the reply. The speed of the response is in itself a shocking confirmation of the incident's importance. He has never in his entire career seen a guidance request turned around this quickly. The order is concise and unambiguous. Maintain position. Divert all surface traffic within 5 nautical miles. Salvage assets deploying from Woods Hole. McKittrick exhales slowly, the tension in the room easing just a fraction. The command means everything, and it means nothing. It means that the highest levels of the U.S. government now know what they know. It means that their small ship is no longer alone in this. They are now the custodians of a secret of immense value. And it means that whatever the Soviet submarine left behind on the ocean floor, 400 feet down, is classified at a level that no one outside of a handful of rooms in Washington will ever be allowed to speak of. 2 days later, at the docks of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, the physical response begins to take shape. A massive crane moves like a slow, deliberate beast, its cables groaning under a heavy load. It is lifting a small, stout, and almost whimsical-looking submersible onto the deck of its support ship, the Lulu. The submersible is named Alvin. It is shaped like a thick, powerful beetle, its hull painted a functional white. Its small, round windows look like the compound eyes of an insect. The men who are preparing Alvin for its mission are not the typical spit-and-polish sailors of the U.S. Navy. They are a unique blend of civilian scientists and military specialists. Dr. Robert Ballard, a geologist and oceanographer in his late 30s, his face sharp with a quiet, intellectual excitement, runs through the final pre-dive checks. Working alongside him is Commander William Nicholson, a Navy salvage specialist with steady, calloused hands and a face that has seen the immense pressures of the deep before. They load the submersible with their tools, heavy-duty spanners, high-intensity lights, specialized cameras loaded with sensitive film, and the careful, custom-built coffins of recovery gear. There is a sense of reverence in their movements. This is not a routine scientific dive. This is not a mission to study deep-sea vents or to explore the geology of the continental shelf. This is a journey into the heart of a secret. Ballard, wiping grease from his hands, looks over at Nicholson with a wry smile. "You ever get tired of finding other people's secrets?" he asks. Nicholson doesn't miss a beat. "Only when they're boring," he replies. Ballard smiles, but his jaw is tight. They both know this will not be boring. This could be a minefield of intelligence, of unknown technology, and of profound danger. They are about to descend into a place where the Cold War is being fought, not with missiles and bombers, but with wrenches and manipulator arms in the crushing, silent dark of the deep ocean. With the final checks complete, the support ship Lulu, a unique twin-hulled catamaran designed to carry and deploy the submersible, arrives on station over the coordinates of Junction Alpha 7. The sea is calm now, a flat, gray sheet under an overcast sky. The submersible Alvin, looking small and fragile against the vastness of the ocean, is lowered into the water between the Lulu's 2 hulls. Dr. Robert Ballard, Commander William Nicholson, and a pilot settle into the cramped, spherical titanium cabin, a space barely 6 feet in diameter. The final hatches are sealed, and with a rush of bubbles, Alvin begins its descent. The journey down into the dark is a slow, methodical process. As the submersible drops away from the surface, the bright, sunlit world is swallowed by the deep. The bubbles from its own release compress into tiny, shimmering diamonds against the thick, acrylic viewports, and then vanish. The ocean outside the small windows cycles through shades of blue from a bright turquoise to a deep, royal navy, and finally to an absolute and impenetrable black. The only light now is the dim, functional glow of the instruments inside the cabin. For 42 minutes, they descend in near silence, the only sounds being the quiet hum of the life support systems and the occasional professional call-out from the pilot. The instruments on the panel show the external pressure climbing relentlessly, a constant physical reminder of the immense weight of the water above them. Ballard, his face pressed close to one of the small viewports, feels like a man watching the world's eyes slowly closing. Finally, the altimeter indicates they are approaching the seabed. The pilot activates Alvin's powerful external lamps, and two brilliant white beams cut paths of light into the sediment below. The seafloor, at a depth of 400 feet, is a landscape of quiet desolation. It is a world of fine sand and silt, sculpted into small, gentle ridges by the deep ocean currents. The pilot gently flies the submersible a few feet above the bottom, following the directions being relayed from the surface support ship, which has the precise location of the submarine's earlier activity. They move slowly, their lights scanning the empty terrain, and then they see them. Stark against the pale sand are two thick, black cables, each as thick as a man's arm, laid out like the arteries of a hidden anatomy across the ocean floor. These are the SOSUS cables, the secret ears of the U.S. Navy. The pilot follows the cables to the point where they intersect, to junction Alpha 7, and there, half buried in the silt, is an indistinct lump. There, Nicholson says, his voice calm and steady over the intercom. Ballard, at the controls of the submersible's manipulator arms, maneuvers Alvin closer. From a housing on the exterior of the sub, a delicate but powerful robotic arm extends, its multi-jointed fingers moving with the careful precision of a surgeon's hand. He gently activates the arm's small thrusters, blowing away the fine layer of silt that is obscuring the object. As the mud clears, the device is revealed. It looks nothing like a crude, hastily planted wiretap. It is a professionally engineered piece of equipment about the size of a 55-gallon oil drum. Its casing is plated in a dull, non-reflective metal, and its edges have been softened and rounded, designed to be as unobtrusive as possible. A small, neat antenna, no more than a foot long, points skyward. It is clearly a transceiver, capable of both receiving and sending signals. Ballard carefully uses the manipulator arm to probe around the base of the device. He discovers that there are no crude wires connecting it to the SOSUS cables. The device is not physically touching them at all. It is buried in the silt just beneath the cables, designed to listen without making any physical contact. It's using inductive coupling, Ballard says, his voice a mixture of professional admiration and alarm. And magnetometers, it's a listening station that doesn't need to touch the cable to read its voice. This is a level of technological sophistication that is both unexpected and deeply troubling. Inductive coupling allows the device to read the faint electromagnetic field that bleeds off the copper wires inside the thick undersea cable. It is a subtle, passive, and incredibly difficult method of espionage to detect. Back in the CIC of the USS Voge, which is still on station a few miles away, a handful of cleared officers and technicians watch the events unfold on a grainy, closed-circuit television feed. The images are being transmitted up from Alvin through a thin, hardwired communications link. They see the ghostly beams of Alvin's lights tracing the shapes on the seafloor. They watch the delicate movements of the manipulator arms as they brush the mud away like the fingers of an archaeologist uncovering a lost relic. For these men who have not left their stations for days, it is a moment of profound and chilling vindication. The ghost that David Hernandez had heard in the deep was not a phantom. It was real, it was sophisticated, and it was now finally staring back at them from the darkness. Weeks after its careful recovery from the cold, dark floor of the Atlantic, the Soviet device sits on a long, sterile bench in a secure, windowless laboratory at the Naval Research Lab in Washington, D.C. The air is cool and dry, filled with the scent of ozone and the low hum of diagnostic equipment. A team of technicians, their faces illuminated by the harsh glare of heat lamps, work with the meticulous patience of bomb disposal experts. The device, which had seemed so alien and monolithic in the deep, is now being cored, layered, and carefully opened, its secrets laid bare one component at a time. The internal architecture of the machine is a testament to the methodical and robust nature of Soviet institutional engineering. There are no flashy, miniaturized circuits. Instead, the technicians find large, rugged magnetic tape drives, each one about the size of a shoebox, designed to continuously record the data being gathered from the cables. The power source is a bank of powerful batteries, carefully shielded and rated to last for up to 18 months of continuous unattended operation. The entire assembly is a marvel of analog precision, a machine that hums with a quiet, undeniable intent. A young technician, his hands steady, carefully lifts a strip of magnetic film from one of the recording units. He reports his initial findings to a gray-suited, grim-faced official from the National Security Agency who is observing the process. "We have 116 days of recorded data, sir," the technician says. "The tracks are separated by cable, so they knew which line was which." The NSA official nods slowly, his mind already racing ahead to the implications. This was not a short-term experimental deployment. This was a long-term strategic intelligence-gathering operation. Edited close-up photographs of the device's interior reveal the true extent of its sophistication. Finely wound magnetic redheads, complex amplifier circuits, and layers of precise shielding designed to filter out the ocean's ambient noise and focus only on the faint electromagnetic signals from the SOSUS cables. This was not a crude or improvised piece of hardware. This was made by people who intimately understood how the cables spoke. From the research lab, the magnetic tapes are transported under armed guard to the sprawling headquarters of the NSA at Fort Meade, Maryland. Here, in another secure subterranean analysis room, a team of cryptographers and signals intelligence analysts begins the painstaking process of decoding the device's secrets. They feed the raw analog outputs from the tapes into their own powerful computer systems. They line up the timestamps on the recordings with their own logs of naval activity. They map the identity of each cable to the specific SOSUS hydrophone arrays they know are laid out on the ocean floor. As they piece together the puzzle, a chilling and deeply alarming truth begins to emerge. The Soviet device did more than just listen to the raw noise on the cables. It was programmed to filter, amplify, and even perform a partial, automated decoding of the signals. The Soviets, it turned out, had broken a significant portion of the low-level encryption that the U.S. Navy used to transmit its SOSUS data. This meant that with enough cleverness, their analysts back in Moscow could reconstruct the intelligence in clear human terms. They could determine where American sonar contacts were being made, when they passed a certain array, and they could even perform cross-bearing calculations to get a precise fix on a submarine's location. An NSA section chief, a man who has spent his entire career believing in the inviolable security of the SOSUS network, stares at the preliminary analysis report, his face pale. "If that's right," he says to a colleague, his voice barely a whisper, "they didn't just see the noise from our network, they saw our map." The implications of this statement are staggering. The SOSUS network was the United States' single greatest advantage in the undersea Cold War. It was the home field advantage, a secret system that allowed them to track the movements of the entire Soviet submarine fleet with a godlike omniscience. It was the unseen map upon which they based their entire naval strategy. Now they were faced with the horrifying possibility that their adversary had been looking over their shoulder, reading that same secret map for months, if not longer. The Soviets had not just planted a bug. They had gained a window into the very mind of the U.S. Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Command. They could see how the Americans tracked their submarines. They could identify the gaps and weaknesses in the SOSUS network. And most dangerously, they could learn the patterns of American naval operations, knowledge that would be invaluable in any future conflict. The single anomalous blip that Petty Officer Hernandez had detected on his sonar screen had now revealed a systemic intelligence failure of catastrophic proportions. The game had changed. The Americans had been playing chess, believing their opponent could not see the board. Now they knew that their opponent not only saw the board, but had been secretly recording every move they made. The revelation that the Soviets had been reading the Americans' secret underwater map sent a shockwave through the highest levels of the U.S. government. On November 18, 1971, just days after the recovery of the device, the issue was brought before the president himself in the tense, windowless confines of the White House Situation Room. The air in the room was cool and heavy with the weight of the decisions that had to be made. President Richard Nixon sat at the center of the large mahogany table, his hands steepled, his face a mask of intense concentration. Around him sat the principal architects of America's Cold War intelligence and military strategy. Richard Helms, the formidable director of Central Intelligence, Admiral Noel Gaylor, the brilliant but cautious director of the NSA, and Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, the bold and aggressive chief of naval operations. These were men who understood, in a way few others could, the profound meaning of a small, unauthorized antenna on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. The discussion was sharp, focused, and freighted with immense strategic risk. The initial analysis of the recovered device was presented, laying bare the sobering truth. The Soviets had achieved a major intelligence breakthrough, compromising the crown jewels of American anti-submarine warfare. The question now was not what had happened, but how to respond. Three distinct and conflicting options emerged. Richard Helms, representing the classic, aggressive stance of the CIA, argued for immediate and decisive action. "We have to retrieve it," he said, his voice firm. "This is an active intelligence-gathering operation against us. We need to take it off the board, study it exhaustively, and learn everything we can from their technology. If they've planted one of these, they've likely planted others." His position was clear: deny the enemy the asset and exploit the intelligence windfall from the captured hardware. Admiral Gaylor of the NSA, whose own organization's codes had been compromised, offered a more subtle and cunning alternative. His world was one of signals, of deception, of the quiet and patient manipulation of information. "I say we leave it," he countered, "or rather we leave a version of it. We now know exactly what they're listening for and how they're listening. This gives us a unique opportunity. We can build our own version of their device, put it back in the same spot, and use it to feed them false data. We can turn their greatest intelligence advantage into a trap." Gaylor's gambit was to transform their vulnerability into a weapon of disinformation. Admiral Zumwalt, the CNO, representing the direct operational concerns of the Navy, advocated for a third path, one that balanced operational security with a show of strength. "Our primary duty is to deny them any capability, period," he stated, his naval officer's sense of propriety offended by the sheer audacity of the Soviet operation. "We must take their device, we must study it, and if necessary, we should announce our findings publicly. Let them know that we know. Let them know they can't operate with impunity in our backyard." Zumwalt's approach was to shut down the operation and create a diplomatic deterrent against future attempts. President Nixon listened intently to the three arguments, weighing the complex matrix of risks and rewards. To retrieve the device, as Helms suggested, was the safest option, but it would also alert the Soviets that their operation had been discovered, allowing them to correct their mistakes and improve their methods for the next attempt. To go public, as Zumwalt suggested, risked a major diplomatic incident with the Soviet Union, escalating tensions at a time when Nixon was carefully pursuing a policy of détente. It was Admiral Gaylor's idea, the deceiver's gambit, that held the most appeal. It was the riskiest of the three options, but it also offered the greatest potential reward. If they could successfully fool the Soviets into thinking their listening post was still active, they could not only deny them real intelligence, but they could actively shape their adversaries' understanding of the battlefield. They could make the Soviets see ghost submarines that weren't there, or miss real submarines that were. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity. "We retrieve the original," Nixon finally said, his decision cutting through the debate. "We analyze it completely. Then we proceed with Admiral Gaylor's suggestion. We will build a duplicate and put it back. For now, the priority is to get that device and learn everything it has to tell us." The decision, recorded as a small, discrete line on a big classified map, set in motion months and ultimately years of intense and highly secret activity. The first phase of the operation was complete. Now the second and far more complex phase was about to begin. It would be a quiet, undeclared war fought not with ships and submarines, but with soldering irons and encryption codes, a battle for control of the very perception of reality in the deep, dark waters of the Cold War. With President Nixon's decision made, the full, formidable weight of the American intelligence and technical communities was brought to bear on the problem of Junction Alpha 7. The quiet, undeclared war of deception had begun. The first step was the meticulous, almost surgical reverse engineering of the captured Soviet device. In the secure labs of the NSA and the Naval Research Lab, technicians worked around the clock, creating a perfect blueprint of their adversary's technology. They mapped every circuit, analyzed every alloy, and deciphered the logic of every component. The goal was not simply to understand the device, but to create a perfect replica. This was a task of immense technical difficulty. The American duplicate had to look identical on the outside, a convincing imitation of Soviet manufacturing techniques. More importantly, it had to behave identically from an electronic perspective. When a Soviet submarine approached it, the device had to respond to their acoustic signals and transmit its data packets in a way that was indistinguishable from the original. But on the inside, the American version would be a hollow Trojan horse. Instead of recording the real, sensitive data from the SOSUS cables, its carefully designed circuitry would be loaded with a curated stream of disinformation. NSA cryptographers and naval intelligence analysts worked for weeks to craft this false data. It was an art form in itself. The information had to be subtly flawed, not overtly wrong. It had to look and feel like genuine SOSUS output, complete with the system's known quirks and background noise, but with carefully inserted anomalies, phantom submarine contacts, slightly altered patrol routes for real American submarines, and misleading acoustic signatures. Each of these anomalies was a piece of bait, a breadcrumb designed to be traceable if the Soviets acted upon it. Once the mock device was built and tested, the second phase of the operation began. In the winter of 1972, under the cover of a routine scientific mission, the submersible Alvin and its support ship returned to the now famous coordinates of Junction Alpha 7. They descended once more into the crushing dark and carefully planted the Trojan horse device in the exact same spot where the original had been found, burying it in the silt just as the Soviets had done. Then they withdrew, leaving the bait in the trap. All they could do now was wait and listen. The entire American anti-submarine warfare network in the Atlantic was put on a quiet, heightened alert. Sonar operators on ships and at shore stations were briefed to listen for the return of Soviet submarines to the area. For weeks, the ocean was quiet. Then the trap was sprung. A Soviet Victor-class submarine, its acoustic signature matching the one David Hernandez had originally detected, was tracked moving back toward the junction point. It slowed, took up a hovering position directly over the site, and then American sonar. Operators detected a faint, coded acoustic signal, an acoustic key. It was the release tone, a signal designed to command the device on the seafloor to transmit its stored data. The Soviet submarine hovered for a period, presumably receiving the data packet from the American-made device, and then departed the area at high speed. In the blackness of the deep, the Soviet crew believed they had just retrieved a treasure trove of harvested intelligence. Instead, they had taken a carefully crafted package of lies, a poison pill that was now being injected directly into the heart of their own naval intelligence analysis system. Over the next few months, this scene was repeated 3 times. Different Soviet submarines would arrive, trigger the device, and collect their packets of disinformation. For the analysts back at the NSA, the real work was just beginning. Their task was now to watch the vast chessboard of the Atlantic and see if their opponents' pieces moved in any unusual ways. They began a painstaking process of correlation, comparing the false data they had fed the Soviets with the actual real-world movements and tactics of the Soviet submarine fleet. And slowly, they began to see the results. They spotted subtle but significant anomalies in Soviet patrol patterns. A group of attack submarines might be retasked to investigate a phantom American ballistic missile submarine contact that had been planted in the data. They might see a Soviet submarine commander making a tactical decision that only made sense if he was acting on a specific piece of the flawed intelligence. Where the Soviets reacted, the American analysts observed the needle move. An analyst in a darkened room at Fort Meade, staring at a map covered in grease pencil tracks, circled one such anomaly. "They took the bait," he reported to his superiors. "We've confirmed it. They're acting on the data." The success of the deception was a victory of immense proportions. It was far more valuable than simply capturing a piece of hardware. By watching how the Soviets reacted to the false intelligence, the Americans learned something far more important. They learned how their adversaries thought. They gained a priceless window into the decision-making processes, the analytical biases, and the operational priorities of the Soviet Naval Command. They had turned their greatest vulnerability into their most effective classroom. The deceiver's gambit had paid off, and the quiet, underwater war of whispers and shadows had a new and far more complex chapter. The successful deception at Junction Alpha 7 was a masterpiece of technological cunning, a quiet and brilliant victory in the hidden war beneath the waves. But the story did not end there. The Cold War at sea was not a single decisive battle. It was a long, grinding, and unending contest of measures and countermeasures, a perpetual cycle of adaptation and learning. The Americans, now fully aware of the Soviet Union's capabilities and intent, embarked on a massive and costly program to harden their undersea infrastructure. The age of blissful ignorance was over. In naval installations up and down the East Coast, men and women with sand on their trousers and ash on their lips worked to adjust the ocean's nerves. New SOSUS cables were laid, this time buried in deep trenches carved into the seabed by specially designed sea plows. Layers of new, more advanced shielding were applied to the cables to minimize their electromagnetic leakage. At the shore stations where the data from the hydrophone arrays was processed, new, more complex layers of encryption were implemented. The language of the deep was given a new and harder grammar. The entire philosophy of undersea surveillance began to shift, moving from a static, fortress-like defense to a more dynamic and layered system. The briefings in the Pentagon and the NSA changed their language from the cautious phrases of "we think" and "we suspect" to the hard-nosed certainty of "we know." The Soviets, for their part, were not idle. While they were being fed a stream of disinformation from Alpha 7, their own patient, methodical intelligence-gathering efforts continued unabated. American surveillance flights and ships began to pay much closer attention to the movements of the Soviet Union's fleet of hydrographic research ships. These were civilian-flagged vessels, ostensibly engaged in peaceful scientific work like ocean floor mapping. In reality, they were spy ships, bristling with sophisticated sensors. On a cold winter night in 1973, the USS Voge found itself once again shadowing one of these vessels, a ship identified as the Sphere. From a safe distance, through powerful photographic lenses, the American crew documented the Soviet methods. They watched as the Sphere deployed long-towed arrays of magnetometers, sensitive instruments that could detect the tiny magnetic anomalies created by the thick copper cables lying on the seabed. They photographed the ship deploying side-scan sonar arrays, creating detailed acoustic maps of the cable trenches. The Soviet approach was one of immense patience. It was not a series of daring raids, but a long, slow campaign to map, to memorize, and to understand the complete anatomy of their adversary's nervous system. As David Hernandez, now older in practice if not in years, watched the Sphere at work, he understood their strategy. It was like a team of thieves meticulously mapping out every vault and every safe in a city. You don't always have to pick the lock. Sometimes it is enough just to write down the address. This quiet, underwater contest of technology and patience was, however, ultimately vulnerable to the oldest and most simple form of espionage: human betrayal. In the mid-1980s, a former NSA communications specialist named Ronald Pelton, motivated by greed and resentment, walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and sold his country's secrets for a few $1,000s. One of the most damaging secrets he revealed was the existence of Operation Ivy Bells, the American program that had, in a turn of perfect historical irony, placed its own sophisticated listening taps on Soviet undersea cables in the Sea of Okhotsk. Pelton's betrayal was a devastating blow. It rendered much of the technological cleverness of the Alpha 7 deception moot. It reminded the American intelligence community of a hard and timeless lesson. The ocean does not forgive complacency. Deception can buy you a season. Technology can buy you an advantage. But betrayal can undo it all in a single, desperate moment. The only true defense is constant, relentless vigilance. In December of 2021, 50 years after the original incident, a panel of experts gathered at a naval history symposium. The banner behind them read, 50 years, the Alpha 7 incident. In the chairs sat men who were now part of history themselves, a gray-haired David Hernandez, a distinguished Dr. Robert Ballard, and several retired naval officers who had once had to make decisions with knives on maps. The room was filled with students, historians, and a few old men who understood the story not as history, but as memory. Training taught me to recognize the patterns, Hernandez told the room, his voice still steady. Intuition told me when those patterns broke, and luck put me in the right place at the right time. You need all three. Dr. Ballard spoke of the physical challenge. Recovery at that depth is a balance of patience and brute force. You reach into the dark and you pray that the thing you touch doesn't bite back. Someone from the audience asked about the relevance of this half-century-old story in the modern world of fiber optics and satellites. The men on the panel looked at one another. The answer was obvious. The theater of competition has widened, but the fundamental contest remains the same. The undersea cables of today carry not the analog whispers of SOSUS, but the digital lifeblood of the entire global economy. The trillions of dollars of financial transactions, the terabytes of data that fuel our interconnected world. The game has not ended, its stakes have simply grown higher. You do not stop contesting a vital point just because it is buried under 100 feet of water. You simply find new, more sophisticated ways to defend it. The competition continues.